They arrived at my sister's engagement party wearing black funeral attire with champagne glasses in their hands, laughing as though they had not just chosen celebration over saying goodbye to my son. When my mother raised her glass and announced that my deceased child's $900,000 inheritance should fund my sister's dream wedding because the dead have no use for money, I smiled quietly and made a single phone call that would ensure none of them would ever see a single cent of what my son had left behind. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The morning of Tuesday, October 17th began with the kind of gray sky that seems to absorb sound and color from the world, leaving everything muted and distant. I stood in my bedroom in front of the full-length mirror, attempting to fasten the clasp of a simple black dress that I had purchased 3 days earlier for a purpose I still could not fully process. My hands trembled as I worked the small hook through the fabric loop, my fingers refusing to cooperate with the simple mechanical task. The dress was modest and appropriate, purchased from a department store during a shopping trip I had made in a fog of disbelief and administrative necessity. My name is Dr. Elena Hartfield, and I am 46 years old. I work as a research scientist specializing in renewable energy systems at a private technology firm in Portland, Oregon. For the past 23 years, my life has been defined by two equally important commitments: my professional work developing sustainable energy solutions, and my role as mother to my only child, my son Daniel. On October 10th, exactly 1 week before this gray morning, Daniel was killed in a vehicular accident on Interstate 5 while returning home from a weekend hiking trip with friends. He was 22 years old, 7 months away from graduating with honors from the University of Washington with a degree in environmental engineering, and he died instantly when a semi-truck driver fell asleep at the wheel and crossed the median into oncoming traffic. The week following Daniel's death had passed in a strange state of suspended reality where time seemed simultaneously frozen and accelerated. There were dozens of phone calls to make, arrangements to finalize, paperwork to complete, and people to notify. Each task required me to speak about my son in past tense, to refer to his body as remains, to make decisions about flowers and music and burial plots as though these administrative details bore any relationship to the vibrant, brilliant, compassionate person who had existed until 7 days ago. Friends and colleagues from my workplace had rallied around me with meals, offers of assistance, and quiet expressions of sympathy that acknowledged the inadequacy of any words in the face of such loss. My family, however, had been notably absent during this week of immediate grief and frantic preparation. My mother, Patricia Rosewood, had expressed shock and sadness when I called to inform her of Daniel's death, but the conversation had been brief and somewhat distracted. My younger sister, Vanessa, had sent a text message offering condolences that felt perfunctory and emotionally distant. My older brother, Marcus, had not responded at all to the voicemail I left informing him of his nephew's death. This absence of family support during the worst week of my life was painful, but not entirely surprising given the complicated dynamics that had characterized our relationships for decades. I had grown up in a family system where emotional expression was discouraged, practical concerns took precedence over feelings, and certain members received dramatically different treatment than others. My mother had always shown clear favoritism toward Vanessa, my younger sister by 8 years, treating her as the precious baby of the family whose needs and desires superseded everyone else's considerations. Vanessa had been indulged throughout her childhood and adolescence in ways that my brother and I never experienced, receiving expensive gifts, having her mistakes excused or minimized, and being celebrated for accomplishments that would have been considered ordinary if achieved by Marcus or myself. This favoritism had intensified as Vanessa reached adulthood. My mother had contributed substantially to Vanessa's college expenses despite the fact that Vanessa had shown minimal academic dedication and eventually dropped out after 3 semesters. When Vanessa decided she wanted to pursue a career in event planning, my mother had provided seed money for a business that folded within 18 months due to poor management and lack of genuine effort. When Vanessa accumulated credit card debt through impulsive spending on luxury items, my mother had quietly paid off the balances without requiring any accountability or repayment plan. This pattern of rescuing Vanessa from the consequences of her choices had created a dynamic where my sister had never developed financial responsibility or realistic expectations about life. In contrast, My mother had provided minimal support for my educational pursuits despite my strong academic performance and clear career direction. I had financed my undergraduate degree through scholarships, work-study programs, and student loans that took me 15 years to repay. My graduate education in environmental science had been similarly self-funded, with no family contributions or assistance. When I purchased my first home at age 31, my mother did not offer a down payment gift or any form of financial help, explaining that she believed I was capable of managing on my own and did not need assistance in the way that Vanessa did. This differential treatment had created understandable resentment over the years, though I had eventually made peace with the reality that my mother's love and support were distributed unequally among her children. I focused on building my own life, developing my career, and creating a warm and supportive home for Daniel after his father and I divorced when Daniel was 7 years old. The divorce had been amicable, prompted by the recognition that my ex-husband, Robert, and I had grown into fundamentally incompatible people who wanted different things from life. Robert had subsequently remarried and moved to Northern California, maintaining a cordial but somewhat distant relationship with Daniel that involved regular phone calls, occasional visits, and consistent child support payments but limited emotional intimacy. Daniel had been the center of my world for his entire life. From the moment I first held him in the hospital, I felt a sense of purpose and connection that exceeded anything I had experienced professionally or personally. He was an exceptional child not because of any extraordinary talents or achievements, though he certainly possessed both intelligence and capability, but because of his fundamental kindness and genuine interest in making the world better. He volunteered at environmental conservation projects throughout his teenage years, tutored younger students in science and mathematics, and spoke passionately about his desire to develop renewable energy solutions that could address climate change while creating economic opportunities in underserved communities. The relationship between Daniel and my extended family had been complicated by the same dynamics that affected my own relationships with them. My mother had shown far less interest in Daniel than she later demonstrated toward Vanessa's children when my sister eventually had 2 daughters, Emma and Sophie, now aged 6 and 4. Daniel had noticed this differential treatment as he grew older, commenting on several occasions that his grandmother seemed to consider him less important or interesting than his younger cousins. I had tried to shield him from the worst of the family dynamics, while also helping him understand that some people had limited capacity for equitable love, and that their limitations reflected their own issues rather than his worthiness. 3 years ago, when Daniel was 19 and midway through his sophomore year of college, his paternal grandfather, Robert's father Samuel Hartfield, passed away unexpectedly from a heart attack. Samuel had been a successful commercial real estate developer who had accumulated substantial wealth over his career. His relationship with Daniel had been warm and supportive, characterized by genuine interest in Daniel's education and aspirations. Samuel had frequently told Daniel that he reminded him of himself at that age, full of idealism and determination to make a meaningful contribution to society. Samuel's will included a substantial bequest to Daniel in the amount of $900,000, to be held in trust until Daniel reached age 25 or completed his undergraduate degree, whichever came first. The trust was structured to provide for Daniel's educational expenses immediately, while preserving the principal for his use upon meeting the distribution conditions. Samuel had included a letter with the trust documents explaining that he wanted to provide Daniel with financial security and opportunity to pursue meaningful work without being constrained by economic necessity in the way that Samuel himself had been as a young man. When news of this inheritance reached my family, the response was immediate and revealing. My mother called me within days of Samuel's funeral to discuss the inheritance, asking detailed questions about the amount, the distribution conditions, and what Daniel planned to do with the money. Her interest felt intrusive and inappropriate, particularly given that she had never shown comparable interest in Daniel's life or well-being prior to learning about his sudden wealth. Vanessa had similarly reached out, suddenly expressing interest in connecting with her nephew and suggesting family gatherings that had never been proposed before the inheritance became known. I had been protective of Daniel and the inheritance, making clear to my family that the money was Daniel's alone, and that decisions about its use would be made by Daniel according to his own values and priorities. Daniel himself had been thoughtful and mature about the inheritance, expressing gratitude for his grandfather's generosity while also feeling some discomfort with sudden wealth that he had not earned through his own efforts. He had planned to use a portion of the funds to pay for his remaining undergraduate education debt-free, invest the majority of the principal in diversified assets that would grow over time, and potentially use some portion to fund environmental conservation projects that aligned with his values. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Now Daniel was gone, killed senselessly by someone else's negligence, and the inheritance that was meant to launch his adult life had become part of his estate. As his sole heir, I would inherit the trust assets along with Daniel's other limited possessions. The money felt meaningless in the face of loss, a poor substitute for the person I would never see again, never speak with again, never watch build the life he had been working toward. I finished fastening the dress and moved to the small desk in the corner of my bedroom where I had organized the funeral service details. The service was scheduled for 2 o'clock that afternoon at Riverside Memorial Chapel, a non-denominational venue that could accommodate approximately 150 people. I had worked with the funeral director to create a service that honored Daniel's values and personality, incorporating environmental themes, selecting music he had loved, and inviting several of his friends to share remembrances. The burial would follow at Greenwood Cemetery, where I had purchased 2 adjacent plots so that eventually I could be laid to rest beside my son. 3 days earlier, I had called my mother to provide the funeral details and express my hope that the family would be present to support me and honor Daniel's memory. The conversation had been strange and uncomfortable in ways I struggled to articulate. My mother had responded to the funeral information with what sounded like reluctance, hemming and hawing about the date and time as though checking a social calendar for conflicts. When I asked directly whether she planned to attend, she had avoided giving a clear answer, saying that she would need to see what was possible and that she would let me know. This evasive response had been hurtful and bewildering. My son had died. His funeral was in 3 days. What possible conflict could take precedence over being present for your daughter during the worst crisis of her life? I had not pressed for clarification during that call, too exhausted and grief-stricken to pursue answers that should not have required pursuit in the first place. I told myself that surely she would be there, that whatever hesitation she was expressing would resolve itself, and that when the moment came my mother would do what any decent person would do and show up for her grieving child. Yesterday, Monday afternoon, I had received a phone call from Vanessa that clarified my mother's evasiveness in the most devastating way imaginable. Vanessa's voice had been bright and excited, completely inappropriate given the circumstances, as she launched into an explanation without preamble or sensitivity. She was calling to let me know that she and her fiancé Bradley had decided to move forward with their engagement party, which they had been planning for months, and the only date that worked with the venue availability and their preferred caterer was Tuesday, October 17th at 3 o'clock in the afternoon. The words had not immediately made sense to me. I asked her to repeat what she had said, certain that I had misunderstood. Vanessa repeated the information with slight annoyance in her voice, as though I was being deliberately obtuse. She and Bradley were having their engagement party on Tuesday afternoon. She hoped I would understand that they could not postpone the event because of all the deposits and arrangements that had already been made. She said that she was sure Daniel would have wanted them to celebrate their happiness, rather than letting his death disrupt their plans. I had stood in my kitchen holding the phone, unable to formulate a response to something so stunningly cruel and inappropriate. Vanessa continued talking, explaining that Mom and Marcus would be attending the engagement party, and that they hoped I would not be upset about the scheduling conflict. She emphasized that the party had been planned for months, long before anyone could have anticipated Daniel's accident, and that it was unreasonable to expect them to cancel their celebration just because the funeral happened to fall on the same day. The stunning selfishness and lack of empathy in this explanation had taken my breath away. This was not a minor conflict between 2 relatively equal social obligations. This was a choice between celebrating an engagement party and attending the funeral of a 22-year-old who had died tragically. This was a choice between supporting a grieving mother and sister or drinking champagne to toast a relationship milestone. This was a choice that revealed exactly how little my family valued me, and how little they had valued Daniel. I had ended the phone call without saying much of anything, too shocked and hurt to articulate the magnitude of their betrayal. After hanging up, I had sat at my kitchen table for over an hour, staring at nothing, trying to process what I had just learned. My mother, my sister, and my brother had chosen to attend an engagement party rather than my son's funeral. They had made this choice consciously and deliberately, with full awareness that their absence would compound my grief during an already unbearable time. The absence of my family at Daniel's funeral would be noticed by others in attendance. Friends and colleagues would wonder where my mother and siblings were, would ask if they were unwell or unable to travel. I would have to decide whether to protect my family's reputation by offering polite fictions about their absence, or to tell the truth about their choice and accept the judgment and pity that would follow. Either option was humiliating and painful, forcing me to manage others' reactions to my family's cruelty, while simultaneously experiencing my own grief and devastation. Now it was Tuesday morning, October 17th, and I stood in my bedroom preparing to bury my son without the presence or support of my own mother, sister, or brother. The betrayal felt almost as overwhelming as the grief itself, adding another dimension of loss to an already devastating situation. I had lost my child, and in the same moment I had lost whatever illusions I still maintained about my family's capacity for basic human decency and compassion. I gathered my purse and the folder containing the funeral service program, took one final look around my bedroom to ensure I had everything I needed, and walked out to my car. The drive to Riverside Memorial Chapel took 20 minutes through gray drizzle that matched my emotional state perfectly. When I arrived, several of Daniel's friends were already present, along with some of my colleagues from work who had come early to offer support. Their presence was comforting, a reminder that while my biological family had failed me utterly, I was not entirely alone in this nightmare. The service itself was beautiful and terrible in equal measure. Daniel's friends shared stories that made mourners laugh through tears, remembering his quirky sense of humor, his passionate arguments about environmental policy, his tendency to adopt stray causes and people with the same enthusiasm others reserved for hobbies. My colleague Dr. Sarah Mitchell delivered a brief reflection on the loss of potential, on the tragedy of a brilliant young person whose contributions to the world would never be realized. I managed to speak for approximately 3 minutes, expressing gratitude for the people who had shown up to honor Daniel, and sharing my belief that his kindness and idealism had made the world better during his brief time in it. Throughout the service, I was acutely aware of the empty seats where my family should have been sitting. The absence felt like a physical presence, a void that others surely noticed even if they were too polite to comment. When the service concluded and people lined up to offer condolences, several asked tentatively about whether my mother was all right or whether my siblings had been unable to make the journey. I offered vague responses about schedule conflicts, protecting my family even as they demonstrated they deserved no such protection. The burial that followed was mercifully brief. Daniel's casket was lowered into the ground as rain began to fall more heavily, nature itself seeming to weep for a loss that defied comprehension. I stood at the graveside after others had departed, alone with the unbearable reality that my son was in the ground and my family was raising champagne glasses to celebrate an engagement party. As I drove home in the early evening, exhausted and hollow, I made a decision. My family had shown me who they were with perfect clarity. They had demonstrated that their selfishness and dysfunction exceeded even the minimal decency required to show up for a funeral. This revelation, while devastating, also liberated me from any remaining obligation to protect or accommodate them. They had forfeited any claim on my consideration, my money, or my son's legacy. What came next would be a reckoning they had earned through their unforgivable choice. I arrived home to find a voicemail message waiting on my home phone. I pressed play and heard my mother's voice, slightly slurred with alcohol, calling from what was obviously a noisy party environment. The message was brief and stunningly tone-deaf. She hoped the funeral had gone well, and wanted to let me know that they were having a wonderful time at Vanessa's engagement party. She concluded by saying that she would like to speak with me soon about Daniel's inheritance and about how we as a family might use those funds to help Vanessa with wedding expenses, because after all, the living had needs that the dead did not. I stood in my entryway listening to this message, and something fundamental shifted inside me. The grief was still there, overwhelming and absolute. But alongside it now was a cold, clear determination. My family wanted Daniel's inheritance. They believed they were entitled to benefit from money that should have supported the dreams and ambitions of the young man whose funeral they had skipped. They had made their choice, and now they would experience the consequences. I deleted the voicemail, picked up my phone, and made a call that would ensure my family's greed would be answered with exactly what they deserved. Nothing but the knowledge of their own moral bankruptcy. I woke on Wednesday morning to sunlight streaming through curtains I had forgotten to close the night before. The brightness felt aggressive and inappropriate, as though the world had no right to be cheerful when my son was newly in the ground. For several moments I lay motionless, experiencing the cruel phenomenon that occurs after profound loss where consciousness returns before memory, creating a brief window of normalcy before reality crashes back with renewed force. Then I remembered everything. The funeral, the empty seats where family should have been, the voicemail message from my mother requesting access to Daniel's inheritance to fund Vanessa's wedding expenses. The audacity of that request still had the power to take my breath away even 12 hours after first hearing it. My family had demonstrated such spectacular failure of basic human decency that it seemed almost beyond comprehension, yet the evidence was irrefutable. They had consciously chosen to attend a party rather than support me during the worst crisis of my life, and having made that choice, they felt entitled to request money that rightfully belonged to the child whose funeral they had skipped. The sheer moral bankruptcy required to make such a request suggested a level of selfishness and dysfunction that exceeded even my already diminished expectations of them. I rose from bed and moved through my morning routine mechanically, performing familiar tasks without conscious thought or engagement. Shower, coffee, the pretense of breakfast that I could not actually bring myself to eat. The house felt simultaneously too empty and too full of Daniel's presence. His hiking boots still sat by the back door where he had left them after his previous weekend trip. His jacket hung on the coat rack in the hallway. His undergraduate research papers and environmental policy books were stacked on the desk in what had been his bedroom during school breaks. Each object was a painful reminder of the life that had been interrupted so senselessly and so permanently. My bereavement leave from work extended for another week, providing time to handle the administrative aftermath of death that modern society generates with impressive efficiency. There were insurance claims to file, accounts to close, utilities to cancel at Daniel's apartment near campus, belongings to sort and donate or store. Each task required me to prove repeatedly that Daniel was dead, to provide certified copies of the death certificate to various institutions, to navigate bureaucratic processes designed for efficiency rather than sensitivity. I had begun working through this list methodically, treating it as a project with discrete tasks that could be completed and checked off, creating an illusion of forward progress, even as the fundamental reality remained unchanged. However, the phone call I had made the previous evening after hearing my mother's voicemail had set in motion a different kind of administrative process, one that would have far more significant implications for my family than they currently understood. I had contacted my attorney Michael Chun, who had handled estate planning documents for both Daniel and myself several years earlier when Daniel first learned of his grandfather's substantial bequest. Michael was a thoughtful and competent attorney in his late 50s who specialized in estate planning, trust administration, and probate matters. More importantly, he was someone I trusted to handle sensitive matters with both professional competence and personal discretion. When I reached Michael on his cell phone Tuesday evening and explained the situation, his initial response had been a long silence that communicated shock more effectively than words could have. After that pause, he had asked several clarifying questions to ensure he understood the facts correctly. My family had chosen to attend an engagement party rather than my son's funeral. My mother had left a voicemail message the evening of the funeral requesting that Daniel's inheritance be used to fund my sister's wedding expenses. I wanted to ensure that my family would have no access whatsoever to any portion of Daniel's estate or the trust assets he had inherited from his paternal grandfather. Michael had assured me that as Daniel's sole heir and the executor of his estate, I had complete legal authority to make decisions about the distribution of his assets. The trust that Daniel's grandfather had established had specific provisions regarding what would happen to the funds if Daniel died before reaching the distribution age, and those provisions designated me as the successor beneficiary. My family had no legal claim to any portion of these funds, and their request, while morally repugnant, posed no actual legal threat to my control over the estate. However, Michael had suggested that we take several proactive steps to ensure maximum protection, and to create clear documentation of my intentions regarding the disposition of Daniel's estate. First, he recommended that I execute a detailed affidavit describing the circumstances of the funeral and my family's absence, creating a contemporaneous record of events while they were fresh in memory. This documentation would serve multiple purposes, including potential evidence if family members later attempted to contest any decisions I made regarding the estate, and a clear statement of the justification for excluding them from any inheritance or benefit from Daniel's assets. Second, Michael proposed that we establish a charitable foundation in Daniel's name, funded by a substantial portion of the trust assets, dedicated to supporting environmental conservation and renewable energy research. This foundation would serve as a living memorial to Daniel's values and passions, while also ensuring that the money would be used for purposes he cared about rather than financing the wedding of an aunt who could not be bothered to attend his funeral. The foundation structure would also provide certain tax advantages, while creating a permanent institutional legacy that would honor Daniel's memory far more meaningfully than personal expenditures ever could. Third, Michael recommended that I prepare a detailed letter to my family members explaining exactly why they would not be receiving any financial benefit from Daniel's estate, and outlining the specific actions that had led to this decision. This letter would not be a legal document, but rather a personal communication that made explicit the connection between their choices and the consequences they would experience. Michael felt strongly that I should not leave my family wondering why they were being excluded, but rather should ensure they understood with perfect clarity that their exclusion was a direct result of their demonstrable failure to show basic human decency during my time of greatest need. Finally, Michael suggested that we review and update my own estate planning documents to ensure that my family members were explicitly excluded from any inheritance from my estate as well. Given their behavior, I no longer wished for any of them to benefit financially from my death, and making that exclusion explicit in legal documents would prevent any ambiguity or potential challenge to my intentions. This update would also provide an opportunity to designate charitable organizations and causes that aligned with my values as beneficiaries of my estate, ensuring that my assets would ultimately be used for meaningful purposes, rather than enriching people who had proven themselves unworthy of such benefit. I had agreed to all of Michael's recommendations and had scheduled an appointment for Thursday morning to sign the necessary documents and begin the process of establishing the foundation. In the meantime, Michael would draft the required paperwork and prepare the detailed letter to my family that would explain the consequences of their choices. I felt a grim satisfaction in taking these concrete steps, transforming my anger and hurt into purposeful action that would ensure Daniel's legacy was honored appropriately, and that my family's greed would be definitively thwarted. Wednesday morning brought an unexpected development that provided additional clarity about my family's character and motivations. At approximately 9:30, as I was sorting through some of Daniel's belongings in his bedroom, my doorbell rang. I was not expecting visitors and considered not answering, but the ringing persisted with enough intensity to suggest whoever was outside would not simply go away if ignored. I made my way to the front door and looked through the peephole to see my sister Vanessa standing on the porch, dressed in casual but expensive-looking athleisure wear and holding what appeared to be a large shopping bag. My first instinct was to refuse to open the door, to deny her access to my home and my presence after the unforgivable choice she had made just yesterday. However, a different impulse overrode that initial reaction. I was curious about what could possibly have motivated her to show up at my house the day after skipping Daniel's funeral. What conversation did she imagine we were going to have? What outcome did she expect from this visit? I decided that I wanted to hear whatever she had come to say, if only to confirm that my assessment of her character was accurate, and that the decisions I was making about Daniel's estate were entirely justified. I opened the door but did not invite her inside, instead standing in the doorway with my arms crossed, creating a physical barrier that communicated she was not welcome. Vanessa seemed oblivious to this body language or chose to ignore it, offering me a bright smile that seemed shockingly inappropriate given the circumstances. She held out the shopping bag toward me, and said in a cheerful voice that made my skin crawl that she had brought me some items from the engagement party that she thought might cheer me up. The presumption embedded in this gesture was staggering. She had skipped my son's funeral to attend her engagement party, and now she believed that party favors or leftover decorations would somehow compensate for that absence or provide comfort during my grief. The disconnect between her perception and reality was so profound that it would have been almost comical if it were not so deeply hurtful and offensive. I made no move to accept the bag, simply staring at her in silence and waiting to see what she would say next. Vanessa's smile faltered slightly in response to my lack of reaction, but she pressed forward with what was obviously a prepared speech. She wanted me to know that the engagement party had been absolutely beautiful, and that everyone had said it was the most elegant celebration they had ever attended. The venue had been perfect, the catering had been exquisite, and she and Bradley had received so many wonderful gifts and generous checks from guests that they were feeling overwhelmed with gratitude. She said all of this while still standing on my porch the day after my son's funeral, apparently unable to recognize how obscene it was to be recounting party highlights to a grieving mother whose loss she had treated as less important than her social event. I continued to say nothing, simply watching her with what I hoped was an expression of complete contempt. Vanessa seemed to interpret my silence as interest or possibly approval, because she continued talking with increasing animation. She pulled out her phone and began showing me photographs from the party, swiping through images of decorations, food displays, and group shots of smiling guests in cocktail attire. I noticed that several of the guests in these photographs were wearing black, having apparently come directly from Daniel's funeral to the engagement party without bothering to change clothes. The visual evidence of this transition from memorial service to celebration, captured in digital photographs that Vanessa was now proudly displaying, was grotesque. Then Vanessa arrived at the apparent purpose of her visit. She explained that while the engagement party had been wonderful, she and Bradley were already beginning to feel stressed about the actual wedding planning. They wanted to have a destination wedding at a luxury resort in Maui, with approximately 150 guests, and the preliminary cost estimates were coming in much higher than they had anticipated. The venue alone was going to cost nearly $80,000, and that did not include catering, florals, photography, or any of the other necessary expenses. When she added up all the components of their dream wedding, the total was approaching $300,000. I felt my stomach tighten as I realized where this conversation was headed. Vanessa continued explaining that she and Bradley had some savings, but nothing close to what would be required for the wedding they envisioned. Her voice took on a wheedling quality as she said that Mom had mentioned that Daniel had inherited a substantial sum from his grandfather, and that surely I would want to help my only sister have the wedding of her dreams. After all, she reasoned with stunning insensitivity, Daniel no longer needed the money, and it seemed wasteful to let it sit unused when it could create such beautiful memories for our family. The word family coming from her mouth in this context was particularly galling. She wanted to claim family connection as justification for accessing my dead son's inheritance, having just demonstrated that family connection meant nothing when it conflicted with her social plans. She had skipped Daniel's funeral, an event that required nothing from her except her presence and basic human compassion. But now she wanted hundreds of thousands of dollars to fund a luxury wedding that was purely about her desires and preferences. I finally spoke, my voice low and controlled in a way that required substantial effort to maintain. I asked her if she had any comprehension of how offensive and inappropriate this request was. I asked if she understood that she was standing on my porch the day after my son's funeral, which she had skipped in order to attend a party, asking me to fund her wedding with money that was meant to support the dreams and aspirations of the child whose death she had treated as a scheduling inconvenience. I asked if there was any part of her brain that recognized the moral depravity of what she was saying and doing. Vanessa's expression shifted from cheerful optimism to defensive irritation. Her tone became sharp as she responded that I was being unreasonable and overly emotional. The engagement party had been planned for months and could not simply be canceled because of an unfortunate accident. She insisted that Daniel would have understood and would have wanted them to celebrate their happiness rather than wallowing in sadness. As for the money, she argued that it was selfish of me to hoard resources that could benefit living family members who had real needs and plans, rather than letting the funds sit untouched as some kind of morbid memorial to someone who was gone. The characterization of my son's death as an unfortunate accident, and the suggestion that honoring his memory was morbid wallowing revealed the depths of Vanessa's self-absorption and emotional stunting. She genuinely could not comprehend why her request was problematic, because her worldview placed her desires at the center of all considerations and treated other people's needs, feelings, or losses as secondary concerns that should not interfere with what she wanted. This was not merely selfishness but rather a more fundamental failure of empathy and basic humanity. I informed Vanessa in clear and unambiguous terms that she would not be receiving a single dollar of Daniel's inheritance for her wedding or any other purpose. I explained that the money would be used to establish a charitable foundation in Daniel's name that would support environmental causes he cared about. I told her that her request was not just being declined but that the fact she had made such a request, in this manner and at this time, ensured that I would never voluntarily provide her with financial assistance of any kind for the remainder of my life. I suggested that she leave my property immediately and not return unless explicitly invited, which she should not anticipate happening in the foreseeable future. Vanessa's face flushed with anger and what might have been embarrassment, though the latter seemed unlikely given her demonstrated lack of self-awareness. She insisted that I was making a terrible mistake, and that Mom would be very upset when she heard about my decision. She warned that I was choosing to isolate myself from my family over money, and that I would regret this choice when I was old and alone with no one to care about me. These threats were presumably meant to intimidate me into reconsidering, but they had the opposite effect. They confirmed that my family viewed relationships as transactional arrangements where affection and support were contingent on financial benefit, and that removing the possibility of such benefit would reveal the emptiness of their professed family bonds. I stepped back into my house and closed the door in Vanessa's face without further response. Through the window I watched her stand on the porch for another minute, apparently debating whether to ring the doorbell again, before finally returning to her car and driving away. The entire interaction had lasted perhaps 10 minutes, but had provided valuable confirmation that the decisions I was making regarding Daniel's estate were not only justified but necessary. My family was incapable of recognizing or respecting boundaries, unable to demonstrate basic empathy or compassion, and fundamentally motivated by greed, rather than genuine connection. After Vanessa's departure, I called Michael Chun to inform him of this morning's visit, and to relay the specific statements Vanessa had made regarding the inheritance and her expectations. Michael listened carefully and then suggested that I consider documenting this conversation in writing while the details were fresh, adding it to the affidavit he was already preparing. He noted that Vanessa's explicit statement that Daniel no longer needed his inheritance, and that it should be used for her wedding would be particularly useful evidence of the family's attitude and motivations if any later disputes arose. Michael also informed me that he had made significant progress on drafting the foundation documents, and that the structure he was proposing would provide me with substantial control over how Daniel's funds were utilized, while also creating a formal institutional legacy. The foundation would be named the Daniel Hartfield Memorial Foundation for Environmental Innovation, and would have a mission focused on supporting renewable energy research, conservation projects, and educational programs related to environmental sustainability. I would serve as the founding board president with authority to appoint additional board members and establish grant-making priorities. The remainder of Wednesday passed in a haze of administrative tasks interspersed with waves of grief that would strike without warning, leaving me momentarily unable to function. I worked on sorting Daniel's belongings, setting aside items that held particular significance or memory to keep, identifying things that could be donated to charitable organizations, and disposing of items that had no continued use or value. This process was emotionally exhausting, requiring me to make decisions about physical objects that carried emotional weight far beyond their practical utility. Late in the afternoon, my phone rang with a call from my mother. I considered not answering but ultimately decided that I preferred to have whatever conversation she intended to initiate now rather than prolonging the inevitable confrontation. I answered with a neutral greeting, offering no warmth or invitation for casual conversation. My mother's voice was tense and accusatory as she launched immediately into the purpose of her call without preamble or acknowledgement of the funeral she had skipped. She wanted to know what I had said to Vanessa to upset her so terribly. Vanessa had called her in tears, reporting that I had been cruel and unreasonable, that I had refused to help with wedding expenses, and that I had ordered her off my property. My mother's tone suggested that she viewed me as the transgressor in this situation, the person who had behaved inappropriately and owed explanations and apologies. The complete absence of any acknowledgement that she had skipped her grandson's funeral to attend a party was stunning even by the low standards I had come to expect from her. I responded with a question rather than an explanation. I asked my mother if she had any awareness of how profoundly inappropriate it was to contact me demanding money for Vanessa's wedding on the same day I buried my son. I asked if she possessed any capacity to recognize that her absence from Daniel's funeral was an unforgivable betrayal that demonstrated I meant nothing to her beyond my potential utility, as a source of financial resources for her favorite child. I asked if there was any scenario in which she would prioritize my needs and feelings over Vanessa's desires. My mother's response was defensive and self-justifying. She insisted that the engagement party had been scheduled months in advance, and that it would have been financially irresponsible to cancel it after deposits had been paid and arrangements finalized. She claimed that I was being selfish by expecting the entire family to disrupt their plans because of something that could not be changed or prevented. She argued that Daniel was gone, and that dwelling on the funeral was less important than focusing on celebrating the living and their milestones. Each statement revealed a worldview in which her own convenience and Vanessa's preferences took absolute precedence over my grief or Daniel's memory. I informed my mother that she and the rest of my family would not be receiving any financial benefit from Daniel's estate, and that I was establishing a charitable foundation in his name that would use the inheritance for environmental causes rather than personal enrichment. I explained that her choice to skip his funeral had made clear where her priorities lay, and that I was simply aligning my decisions with the reality of our relationship, rather than the fiction I had maintained for too long. My mother's response shifted from defensive justification to threats and warnings. She insisted that I was making decisions I would regret, and that family was more important than money. She suggested that I was not thinking clearly due to grief, and that I should postpone major financial decisions until I was in a more rational state of mind. She warned that if I followed through with excluding the family from Daniel's inheritance, I would be creating a rift that could never be repaired, and that I would end up isolated and alone. These threats held no power over me because they were based on a false premise. My mother was threatening to withdraw family connection and support that had never genuinely existed in the first place. She was warning me of isolation and abandonment that I had already experienced when she chose a party over my son's funeral. The consequences she was threatening were consequences I had already endured, and I had survived them. Her leverage was gone because she had already done the worst thing she could do, and I was still standing. I ended the call by informing my mother that my decisions were final, and that further attempts to pressure or manipulate me would simply result in me blocking her number and refusing all contact. I suggested that she examine her own choices and priorities if she was confused about how our relationship had reached this point. Then I disconnected the call before she could respond, experiencing a sense of liberation that came from finally stating clear boundaries and refusing to accept mistreatment in the name of family obligation. Thursday morning arrived with the appointment with Michael Chun to sign the foundation documents and finalize the legal framework for ensuring my family would be permanently excluded from any benefit from Daniel's estate or my own. As I prepared to leave for Michael's office, I felt not happiness but rather a grim satisfaction in taking action that would honor Daniel's memory appropriately while ensuring that those who had failed him so spectacularly would face tangible consequences for their choices. The battle was just beginning, but I was prepared for whatever came next. Thursday morning arrived with the peculiar clarity that sometimes follows nights of minimal sleep. I had spent much of the previous evening lying awake, not consumed by the paralyzing grief that had characterized the first days after Daniel's death, but rather engaged in systematic thinking about the future I needed to construct. The conversation with my mother had crystallized something essential. I was not simply responding to a family crisis, but rather acknowledging a fundamental truth about relationships that I had avoided confronting for decades. My family had never valued me except as a resource to be exploited, and Daniel's death had revealed this reality with brutal clarity. I dressed carefully for the meeting with Michael Chun, selecting professional attire that felt appropriate for the serious business we would be conducting. There was something psychologically significant about treating this appointment with the formality it deserved rather than approaching it casually. I was not simply signing papers but rather making decisions that would shape Daniel's legacy and define the boundaries of my life going forward. The weight of these choices required acknowledgement through both internal seriousness and external presentation. Michael's office was located in a professional building in downtown Portland, occupying a corner suite with large windows that overlooked the Willamette River. I had been there several times over the years for various legal matters, and the space had always conveyed competence and stability through its understated professional decor and organized efficiency. The receptionist recognized me and offered condolences that were brief and sincere before directing me to Michael's private office. Michael rose from behind his desk as I entered, greeting me with a handshake and an expression of sympathy that felt genuine rather than performative. He was a man who understood that legal matters often intersected with profound personal circumstances, and that his role extended beyond technical expertise to include helping clients navigate emotionally complex situations with clarity and purpose. He gestured toward the small conference table in the corner of his office where he had already arranged several neat stacks of documents alongside 2 leather portfolios. Before diving into the paperwork, Michael took time to review the overall strategy we would be implementing and the specific purposes that each document would serve. He explained that our approach had 3 primary objectives: establishing permanent legal protection against any claims my family might attempt to make on Daniel's estate or my own assets, creating a meaningful institutional legacy that honored Daniel's values and passions, and documenting the circumstances that justified these decisions in case questions or challenges arose in the future. The first set of documents related to the establishment of the Daniel Hartfield Memorial Foundation for Environmental Innovation. Michael had worked with remarkable speed to draft comprehensive founding documents that outline the foundation's mission, governance structure, funding sources, and operational guidelines. The mission statement focused on supporting renewable energy research, environmental conservation projects, and educational initiatives that promoted sustainability and ecological responsibility. These priorities directly reflected Daniel's academic focus and personal values, ensuring that the foundation would serve as an authentic extension of his life's work, rather than a generic charitable vehicle. The governance structure designated me as founding president with authority to appoint additional board members and establish specific grant-making priorities within the overall mission framework. Michael had recommended this structure to provide me with meaningful control, while also creating accountability through board oversight and formal decision-making processes. The foundation would be funded initially with $750,000 from Daniel's trust, with the remaining trust assets retained in my personal control for potential future contributions or other uses. This allocation provided substantial resources to launch the foundation, while preserving flexibility regarding the remaining funds. Michael walked me through each section of the founding documents, explaining the legal implications and practical effects of various provisions. He had included clauses that would prevent my family members from ever serving in any capacity with the foundation, ensuring that the institution could not be infiltrated or influenced by people who had demonstrated such profound disregard for Daniel's memory. He had also structured the foundation to operate in perpetuity, rather than spending down its assets, meaning that Daniel's legacy would continue generating positive impact for decades, or potentially centuries into the future. As I reviewed these documents, I felt a sense of rightness that had been absent from my life since Daniel's death. This foundation represented a meaningful response to senseless loss, transforming resources that were meant to support my son's dreams into institutional capacity to advance causes he cared about deeply. The foundation would fund research that might contribute to solving climate challenges Daniel had worried about, support conservation of natural spaces he had loved exploring, and provide educational opportunities for young people who shared his passion for environmental sustainability. This felt like a worthy memorial, far more meaningful than any physical monument or conventional tribute. The second set of documents related to updates to my own estate planning materials. Michael had revised my will, trust documents, and beneficiary designations to explicitly exclude my mother, sister, and brother from any inheritance or benefit from my estate. The language was unambiguous and detailed, naming each person specifically and stating clearly that their exclusion was intentional and reflected my settled judgment about their character and conduct. Michael explained that this explicit exclusion was legally stronger than simply omitting them from the documents, because it prevented any future claims that their omission represented an oversight or mistake, rather than a deliberate choice. My revised estate plan designated the Daniel Hartfield Memorial Foundation as the primary beneficiary of my assets, with secondary beneficiaries including several established environmental organizations that aligned with values Daniel and I shared. The structure ensured that my life's work and accumulated resources would ultimately serve purposes I considered meaningful, rather than enriching people who had proven themselves unworthy of such benefit. Michael had also included provisions that would make it extremely difficult and expensive for my family to challenge these documents, including clauses that would reduce any inheritance to $1 for anyone who contested the estate plan. The third major component of our meeting involved reviewing and finalizing the detailed affidavit, I had drafted documenting the circumstances of Daniel's funeral and my family's absence. Michael had helped me refine this document to focus on factual descriptions rather than emotional characterizations, creating a record that would be credible and persuasive if it ever needed to be presented in legal proceedings. The affidavit described the date and time of Daniel's funeral, the advance notice provided to family members, the specific conversation with Vanessa in which she informed me they would be attending her engagement party instead, and the voicemail message from my mother requesting access to Daniel's inheritance for wedding expenses. Michael had also incorporated into the affidavit my account of Vanessa's visit to my home the day after the funeral and her explicit statements that Daniel no longer needed his inheritance and that the money should be used for her wedding. This contemporaneous documentation created a clear record of my family's attitude and actions during the period immediately following Daniel's death, establishing the factual foundation for decisions I was making about estate distribution. The affidavit was notarized and would be maintained as part of the permanent legal file associated with both Daniel's estate and my own estate planning documents. The fourth and final document we reviewed was the letter to my family members that Michael had drafted based on our previous conversations. This letter was not a legal instrument, but rather a personal communication that served both practical and emotional purposes. Practically, it informed my mother, sister, and brother of decisions I had made regarding Daniel's estate and my own estate planning, eliminating any ambiguity about whether they would receive financial benefits. Emotionally, it provided me with an opportunity to articulate clearly why these decisions had been made and what their conduct had cost them. The letter was direct and unflinching in its assessment of their behavior. It described their decision to attend an engagement party, rather than Daniel's funeral, as a choice that revealed the true nature of our relationships with perfect clarity. It characterized their subsequent requests for access to Daniel's inheritance as demonstrating a level of greed and insensitivity that exceeded anything I could have previously imagined. It explained that I was establishing a charitable foundation in Daniel's name that would use his inheritance to advance causes he cared about rather than financing the lifestyle preferences of relatives who could not be bothered to honor his memory with their presence at his funeral. The letter concluded by making explicit that I had revised my own estate planning documents to exclude them entirely from any inheritance or benefit from my estate. It stated that this exclusion was not a temporary response to grief-driven anger, but rather a permanent decision based on clear-eyed assessment of their character and values. It noted that any future attempts to pressure, manipulate, or guilt me into changing these decisions would simply result in complete cessation of contact and communication. The letter ended without expressions of affection or hope for reconciliation, instead simply stating facts and consequences with the clarity that the situation demanded. Michael asked whether I wanted him to send the letter on my behalf through his office, or whether I preferred to deliver it personally. I considered this question carefully before deciding that I wanted the letter to come from Michael's office on law firm letterhead. This choice served multiple purposes. It communicated that my decisions had legal force and professional support, rather than being impulsive emotional reactions. It created additional documentation in the official file, and it spared me the emotional burden of personal delivery or the possibility of argument and manipulation that might occur if I attempted to communicate these decisions directly. We spent approximately 2 hours working through all of these documents, with Michael explaining each provision and answering questions about implementation and potential complications. His thoroughness and attention to detail provided reassurance that the legal framework we were constructing was solid and defensible. When we finally concluded, I signed multiple copies of various documents with signatures that were witnessed and notarized according to legal requirements. The physical act of signing felt significant, transforming intentions and plans into legally binding commitments that would shape outcomes regardless of future pressures or complications. As I prepared to leave Michael's office, he made one additional suggestion that I found valuable. He recommended that I consider engaging with the environmental and academic communities to publicize the foundation and its mission once the initial administrative work was completed. This publicity would serve several purposes. It would honor Daniel's memory in a public way that his friends and colleagues could participate in and appreciate. It would begin establishing the foundation's reputation and credibility within relevant professional networks, and it would create public awareness of how Daniel's inheritance was being used, making it more difficult for family members to later misrepresent my decisions or claim that I had misappropriated funds for personal benefit. I appreciated this suggestion because it aligned with my desire to ensure that Daniel's legacy was both meaningful and visible. Too often, young people who die tragically are remembered primarily through the circumstances of their death, rather than the substance of their lives and aspirations. The foundation would shift that narrative by keeping Daniel's passions and commitments at the center of how he was remembered and discussed. I told Michael that I would begin reaching out to Daniel's professors and colleagues at the University of Washington to explore possibilities for formal announcements and initial grant-making priorities. I left Michael's office feeling emotionally exhausted, but also experiencing something that resembled peace for the first time since Daniel's death. I had taken decisive action to protect his legacy, and to establish clear boundaries with family members who had forfeited any claim on my consideration or resources. The legal framework was now in place, the documents were signed and filed, and the foundation would begin its work of transforming grief into purpose and loss into lasting positive impact. The drive home took me through neighborhoods where Daniel and I had spent time together over the years. I passed the park where I had taught him to ride a bicycle when he was 6 years old, wobbling uncertainly before finding his balance and pedaling away with a grin of triumph. I drove by the library where we had spent countless Saturday mornings when he was in elementary school, selecting books and sitting together in the reading area, while he discovered stories that sparked his imagination. I noticed the coffee shop where we had met regularly during his college years, discussing his classes and research projects while I offered perspective based on my own scientific career. These memories were painful because they emphasized everything that had been lost, but they also reminded me why the foundation mattered so much. Daniel's life had been full of curiosity, compassion, and commitment to making the world better. Those qualities deserve to be remembered and extended through institutional capacity, rather than being reduced to a tragic news story about a young person killed in an accident. The foundation would ensure that Daniel's brief time on Earth had lasting significance, and that his values would continue influencing outcomes long after those who knew him personally had themselves passed away. When I arrived home, I found several messages waiting on my voicemail from family members. My mother had called twice, her voice alternating between anger and attempts at emotional manipulation, as she demanded that I reconsider my decisions and accused me of choosing money over family relationships. My brother Marcus had left a brief message expressing confusion about what was happening and asking me to call him to explain the situation. Vanessa had sent a text message that combined self-pity with continued requests for financial assistance, claiming that I was destroying her dreams and refusing to support her happiness during what should be a joyful time in her life. I deleted the voicemails without responding and blocked Vanessa's number, so that I would not receive further text messages from her. The letter from Michael's office would arrive within the next few days, providing comprehensive explanation of my decisions, and making clear that further attempts at contact would be unwelcome and unproductive. Until that letter arrived, I saw no purpose in engaging with the drama and manipulation that my family excelled at generating. Instead, I turned my attention to beginning the work of actually establishing the foundation's operations and initial priorities. I drafted an email to Professor Raymond Chen, who had been Daniel's primary faculty mentor in the environmental engineering program at the University of Washington. Professor Chen had attended Daniel's funeral and had shared moving remarks about Daniel's academic potential and his genuine commitment to using engineering skills to address environmental challenges. I explained in the email that I was establishing a foundation in Daniel's name and asked whether Professor Chen might be willing to meet with me to discuss possibilities for memorial scholarships or research grants that would honor Daniel's interests and support students pursuing similar work. I sent similar emails to 2 other faculty members who had worked closely with Daniel, and to the director of the Campus Sustainability Initiative that Daniel had volunteered with throughout his undergraduate years. Each message was carefully crafted to explain the foundation's mission, while also requesting input about how to structure initial grants and programs in ways that would be most meaningful and impactful. I was not simply imposing my own ideas about appropriate memorial activities, but rather seeking to create something that would resonate with the communities and causes that Daniel had cared about most deeply. The responses began arriving within hours, and they were uniformly positive and supportive. Professor Chen replied immediately with condolences and enthusiasm for the foundation concept, suggesting that we meet the following week to discuss specific possibilities. The Sustainability Initiative Director responded with several detailed ideas about how foundation funding could support student research projects, internship programs, and campus conservation initiatives that aligned with Daniel's interests. The outpouring of interest and ideas from people who had known and respected Daniel provided validation that the foundation would indeed serve meaningful purposes, rather than being merely a personal gesture. As evening approached, I felt something shift in my emotional state. The paralyzing grief that had dominated the previous week began coexisting with a sense of forward purpose that made it possible to imagine continuing to live and work despite the magnitude of loss. I would never recover from losing Daniel in any conventional sense of that word, but I could perhaps transform that loss into motivation for ensuring that his brief life had ripple effects that extended far beyond the 22 years he had been given. My family had chosen celebration over compassion, and greed over human decency. They had revealed themselves with perfect clarity, and I had responded by ensuring they would face consequences for those choices. The foundation documents were signed, the legal protections were in place, and the letter explaining my decisions would soon arrive at their homes. What happened next would depend largely on how they chose to respond to this new reality, but I was prepared for any reaction they might have. I had done what was right and what was necessary, and I would not be moved from that position regardless of pressure or manipulation they attempted to deploy. Thursday evening concluded with me sitting in Daniel's bedroom, surrounded by his books and belongings, working on preliminary grant guidelines for the foundation. The work was difficult emotionally but also strangely comforting, providing concrete activity that channeled grief into purpose. I was building something that would outlast my own life, something that would ensure Daniel's values and passions continued shaping the world for generations to come. That felt like the best possible response to loss that could not be prevented or reversed, and it gave me strength to face whatever challenges tomorrow would bring. The weekend passed in a strange suspension between purposeful activity and waves of grief that struck without predictable pattern or warning. I continued working on foundation planning materials, responding to emails from Daniel's professors and colleagues who were offering ideas and support for memorial initiatives, and slowly making progress through the overwhelming task of sorting his belongings. Each activity provided temporary structure and distraction, but the underlying reality of loss remained constant and inescapable. Daniel was gone, and no amount of productive work or forward momentum would change that fundamental devastation. On Saturday afternoon, I received an unexpected visitor that provided a stark contrast to Vanessa's intrusive appearance earlier in the week. Professor Raymond Chen from the University of Washington had driven down from Seattle specifically to meet with me in person rather than waiting for our scheduled phone call the following week. When I opened the door to find him standing on my porch with a leather portfolio under his arm and an expression of genuine concern on his face, I felt a surge of gratitude for this gesture of respect and support from someone who had valued Daniel's potential and promise. Professor Chen was a man in his early 60s with distinguished gray hair and an understated professional manner that conveyed both competence and warmth. He had been Daniel's faculty advisor for the past 2 years and had worked closely with him on undergraduate research projects related to renewable energy systems. Daniel had spoken often about Professor Chen's mentorship and his approach to teaching that emphasized both technical rigor and ethical responsibility in engineering practice. Now Professor Chen stood in my living room, having driven 3 hours on a Saturday afternoon because he believed the foundation concept deserved immediate attention and personal engagement. We sat at my dining table while Professor Chen opened his portfolio and pulled out materials he had prepared over the previous 48 hours. He had drafted a detailed proposal for a memorial scholarship program that would support undergraduate students pursuing environmental engineering, with a focus on renewable energy and sustainability. The scholarship would be named the Daniel Hartfield Environmental Innovation Scholarship, and would provide not just financial support, but also mentorship opportunities, research assistantships, and connections to professional networks in the environmental engineering field. Professor Chen had outlined specific criteria for scholarship selection that emphasized both academic capability and demonstrated commitment to using engineering skills for environmental benefit rather than purely commercial applications. The thoughtfulness and detail of this proposal moved me deeply. Professor Chen had clearly invested significant time and intellectual energy into developing something meaningful, rather than offering generic condolences or superficial gestures. He walked me through each component of the scholarship program, explaining how various elements would work practically and how they aligned with Daniel's specific interests and values. He had even contacted colleagues at other universities to research best practices in memorial scholarship programs, ensuring that his proposal reflected proven approaches rather than untested ideas. Beyond the scholarship proposal, Professor Chun offered something equally valuable: his perspective on Daniel's academic trajectory and the impact Daniel had made on faculty and fellow students during his time in the environmental engineering program. He shared stories I had not heard before about Daniel's contributions to research projects, his willingness to help struggling classmates understand difficult concepts, and his habit of asking questions during lectures that revealed both genuine curiosity and sophisticated analytical thinking. Professor Chen described Daniel as the kind of student that faculty members remembered decades later, not because of exceptional grades or awards, but because of authentic intellectual engagement and sincere commitment to using knowledge for beneficial purposes. These stories provided a gift I had not anticipated: a fuller picture of Daniel's life and impact in contexts I had not directly observed. As a parent, I had known Daniel intimately in our private relationship, but Professor Chen's perspective revealed dimensions of his character and capabilities that were visible primarily in professional academic settings. Hearing these accounts made Daniel's loss feel simultaneously more painful, because they emphasized the magnitude of potential that would never be realized, and more bearable, because they confirmed that his brief life had already touched others and made meaningful differences in ways that would be remembered. Professor Chun and I spent nearly 3 hours discussing the scholarship program, foundation governance, and potential partnerships between the foundation and the university's environmental engineering program. By the time he prepared to drive back to Seattle, we had established a preliminary framework for launching the scholarship in the upcoming academic year, and had identified specific next steps for formalizing the partnership. Professor Chen's visit transformed the foundation from an abstract concept into a concrete initiative, with operational details and enthusiastic collaborators. This progress provided precisely the kind of forward momentum I needed to maintain focus and purpose during an emotionally devastating period. Sunday brought a different kind of emotional challenge. I attended a grief support group that met weekly at a local community center, having been encouraged to seek such resources by my therapist, Dr. Sarah Williams, whom I had begun seeing shortly after Daniel's death. The support group consisted of approximately 15 people who were navigating various forms of significant loss, from deaths of spouses and children to losses of health, careers, or other life circumstances that had fundamentally altered their sense of identity and future. The group was facilitated by a licensed counselor who created space for participants to share their experiences without judgment or pressure to conform to specific timelines or expressions of grief. I had attended the previous week's session as well, but I had remained largely silent during that initial visit, observing the group dynamics and listening to other stories without feeling ready to contribute my own. This week, however, I felt compelled to speak about the situation with my family and the decisions I had made regarding Daniel's estate. The facilitator had opened the session by inviting participants to share anything that felt pressing or unresolved, and I found myself raising my hand before consciously deciding to do so. Speaking to the group about my family's absence from Daniel's funeral and their subsequent demands for access to his inheritance was surprisingly difficult, despite the fact that I had already discussed these events extensively with my therapist and attorney. There was something about articulating the situation to people who had no prior knowledge of my family dynamics or personal history that made the betrayal feel freshly raw and painful. As I described the timeline of events, from Vanessa's phone call informing me of the engagement party conflict to my mother's voicemail requesting money for wedding expenses to my decision to establish a charitable foundation instead, I could see reactions of shock and disapproval on the faces of other group members. When I concluded my account, there was a moment of heavy silence before several people began offering responses that ranged from expressions of outrage on my behalf to gentle questions about whether I might eventually regret cutting off family relationships so decisively. One woman whose adult son had died from cancer 3 years earlier spoke about her own experience with family members who had disappointed her during her crisis, noting that grief often revealed the true nature of relationships that had previously been obscured by polite conventions and habitual interactions. Another participant, a man whose wife had died in a car accident similar to the one that killed Daniel, cautioned against making permanent decisions based on temporary emotions, and suggested that I might want to leave open the possibility of eventual reconciliation. These varied responses reflected the complexity of navigating family relationships in the context of profound loss and betrayal. There were no simple answers or universally correct approaches, only difficult choices that required weighing competing values and priorities. The facilitator did not attempt to direct the conversation toward any particular conclusion, but rather helped the group explore different perspectives and considerations that might inform my ongoing decision-making process. By the end of the discussion, I felt clearer about my reasoning and more confident that my choices reflected genuine values rather than reactive anger, though I also recognized that the situation would likely continue evolving in unpredictable ways. Monday morning arrived with the knowledge that Michael Chen's letter to my family members would be delivered that day through certified mail requiring signatures upon receipt. I found myself experiencing anxious anticipation about how they would respond once they received formal notification of my decisions regarding Daniel's estate and my own estate planning. Part of me expected immediate phone calls filled with rage and accusations, while another part wondered whether they might initially deny or minimize the significance of the letter's contents before gradually recognizing that the situation had changed permanently. I spent Monday morning working from home on projects related to my professional responsibilities at the renewable energy research firm, where I had been employed for the past 14 years. My bereavement leave technically extended through the end of the week, but I had begun gradually resuming work activities as a way of maintaining professional connections and providing structure to days that otherwise felt formless and overwhelming. My supervisor and colleagues had been extraordinarily supportive, making clear that I should take whatever time I needed, while also letting me know that they welcomed my involvement in ongoing projects whenever I felt ready to engage. The work itself provided valuable distraction, and a reminder that I possess professional identity and purpose independent of my role as Daniel's mother. I was reviewing technical specifications for a solar energy system design, when my phone rang shortly after 11 o'clock with a call from an unknown number. I debated whether to answer, suspecting it might be a family member calling from an unfamiliar phone in an attempt to circumvent my decision to block certain numbers, but ultimately I decided that avoiding the conversation would simply postpone an inevitable confrontation. The caller was indeed my brother Marcus, though he was using his workplace phone rather than his personal cell. Marcus was 5 years older than me and had always occupied a middle position in our family dynamics, neither favored like Vanessa nor as overtly dismissed as I had been. He worked as a mid-level manager at a logistics company and had maintained a generally cordial, but emotionally distant relationship with me throughout our adult lives. We spoke occasionally at family gatherings and exchanged brief messages on birthdays and holidays, but we had never developed the kind of close sibling bond that some families maintained across decades and geographical distances. Marcus's tone on the phone was careful and somewhat tentative, suggesting that he recognized the situation was delicate, and that his approach would significantly influence how the conversation unfolded. He began by expressing condolences about Daniel's death, and acknowledging that he should have called sooner to offer support. This belated acknowledgement of his absence during the immediate aftermath of Daniel's death was appreciated, but also insufficient given that 2 weeks had now passed since the accident. Marcus then explained that he had received a letter from my attorney that morning, and was calling to understand exactly what had happened, and why such dramatic legal actions had been necessary. I felt a surge of frustration at the framing of his question, which positioned my decisions as dramatic overreactions rather than appropriate responses to unconscionable behavior. I asked Marcus directly whether he understood why I might be upset that my entire family had chosen to attend Vanessa's engagement party, rather than supporting me at Daniel's funeral. Marcus responded with a justification I had heard before from my mother, explaining that the engagement party had been scheduled months in advance, and that canceling would have resulted in significant financial losses from deposits and commitments that could not be recovered. He seemed to genuinely believe that this financial consideration provided adequate explanation and justification for the choice. I asked Marcus whether he believed that financial considerations outweighed the basic human obligation to support family members during profound crises. I asked whether he could identify any scenario in which he would consider a party more important than a funeral for his nephew. I asked whether he possessed any recognition that his absence had communicated exactly how little I and Daniel mattered compared to Vanessa's social events. These questions were not rhetorical attacks but genuine attempts to understand whether Marcus had any capacity to recognize the moral dimensions of the choices that had been made. Marcus's responses revealed a troubling combination of genuine obliviousness and deliberate avoidance of uncomfortable truths. He insisted that he had not intended to hurt me, and that he had assumed I would understand the difficult position they had all been in regarding the scheduling conflict. He characterized the situation as an unfortunate coincidence, rather than a conscious choice that revealed priorities and values. He seemed genuinely confused about why I was treating their absence as such a significant betrayal rather than simply an awkward situation created by bad timing. This conversation clarified something important about my family dynamics that I had not fully appreciated before. It was not simply that my mother and Vanessa were selfish and manipulative people who consciously chose their own interests over my well-being. Rather, they had created a family culture in which such choices were normalized and rationalized to the point where other family members like Marcus genuinely could not recognize the profound inappropriateness of their behavior. Marcus was not defending an action he knew was wrong, but rather expressing authentic confusion about why anyone would consider their choice problematic in the first place. I explained to Marcus in direct and unambiguous terms that attending a party instead of a funeral was not an awkward scheduling conflict, but rather a fundamental failure of basic human decency and family obligation. I told him that their absence had demonstrated that I meant nothing to them beyond my potential utility as a source of resources or services, and that Daniel's death had apparently been considered less significant than Vanessa's social calendar. I informed him that the decisions outlined in the attorney's letter were final and reflected my settled judgment about our relationships, rather than temporary anger that might dissipate over time. Marcus attempted to negotiate or find middle ground, suggesting that perhaps I could fund some portion of Vanessa's wedding expenses as a gesture of family unity even if I chose to use most of Daniel's inheritance for the charitable foundation. This suggestion revealed that he had fundamentally misunderstood both the situation and my emotional state. I was not in a negotiating posture where compromise was possible or appropriate. My family had failed spectacularly at the most basic test of human relationship, and the consequences of that failure were not subject to bargaining or incremental adjustment. I informed Marcus that the conversation was over, and that I would not be discussing the matter further with him or any other family member. I told him that the letter from my attorney contained all relevant information about decisions I had made, and that attempting to pressure or manipulate me into changing course would simply result in complete cessation of contact. Marcus protested that I was being unreasonable, and that I would regret destroying family relationships over money and wounded pride, but I disconnected the call before he could elaborate further on this theme. The conversation left me feeling emotionally drained, but also confirmed in my assessment that no productive dialogue with my family was possible. They inhabited a reality in which their behavior was defensible and my responses were excessive, and nothing I could say would penetrate that self-justifying worldview. The letter from Michael's office had served its purpose by formally notifying them of consequences they would face, and no additional communication or explanation was necessary or useful. Tuesday brought confirmation that my mother and Vanessa had also received their letters from Michael's office. My mother left a voicemail message that was remarkable in its combination of rage, self-pity, and continued attempts at emotional manipulation. She accused me of being vindictive and cruel, of prioritizing money over family relationships, and of dishonoring Daniel's memory by refusing to support the living relatives who loved him. The irony of this last claim was apparently lost on her given that she had demonstrated the depth of her love for Daniel by attending a party instead of his funeral. Vanessa sent multiple text messages to my work email address, having apparently discovered that channel after I blocked her personal number. The messages alternated between tearful pleas for reconsideration and angry accusations that I was destroying her dreams and sabotaging her happiness during what should be a joyful period in her life. Several messages suggested that I was mentally unstable due to grief, and that my decisions should not be considered valid because I was not thinking rationally. This claim that grief had impaired my judgment was particularly galling given that my decisions had been made in careful consultation with legal counsel and reflected clear-eyed assessment of documented facts rather than emotional hysteria. I forwarded all of these communications to Michael Chun with a brief note asking him to retain them as part of the permanent file. The continued attempts at manipulation and the specific content of my family's messages provided additional evidence that my decisions were justified, and that their concern was purely about financial access rather than genuine relationship or remorse for their behavior. Michael responded within an hour, confirming that he had received and filed the communications and noting that the messages actually strengthened the legal position we had established by demonstrating the family's primary focus on money rather than relationship repair. Wednesday afternoon brought an unexpected complication in the form of a call from my ex-husband Robert, Daniel's father. Robert had attended Daniel's funeral and had been appropriately devastated by the loss of his only child, though our interaction at the service had been necessarily brief given the circumstances. Now Robert was calling from his home in Northern California to express concern about rumors he had heard regarding conflict between me and my family over Daniel's estate. Someone, presumably Marcus or my mother, had reached out to Robert to complain about my decisions and to suggest that he might be able to influence me to reconsider the exclusion of family members from any benefit from Daniel's inheritance. This attempt to recruit Robert as an ally in their campaign for access to Daniel's money was both predictable and offensive. Robert and I had maintained a cordial co-parenting relationship after our divorce, characterized by mutual respect and shared commitment to Daniel's well-being. But we were not intimates who discussed personal matters unrelated to our son. My family's decision to involve him in their dispute with me represented an inappropriate boundary violation that revealed their willingness to exploit any available avenue toward their desired outcome. Robert made clear immediately that he had no intention of attempting to influence my decisions about Daniel's estate, and that he fully supported my authority to determine how Daniel's inheritance should be used. He explained that he was calling primarily to inform me that my family had reached out to him, and to express his own disgust at their behavior both in skipping Daniel's funeral and in subsequently demanding access to his inheritance. Robert shared that during the funeral service he had wondered about the absence of my family, and had assumed there must be some emergency or crisis that prevented their attendance. Learning the actual reason for their absence had fundamentally changed his opinion of people he had known peripherally for over 2 decades. Robert and I spoke for nearly 30 minutes about Daniel, about the foundation I was establishing in his name, and about the profound challenge of continuing to live after losing a child. The conversation was painful, but also comforting in its acknowledgement of shared loss and mutual respect. When we concluded the call, I felt grateful for Robert's support and validation, which contrasted sharply with my biological family's demonstration of selfishness and dysfunction. The people who should have been most supportive had failed completely, while someone with far less obligation had shown up with genuine compassion and appropriate boundaries. Thursday evening I received an email from Professor Chan confirming that the University of Washington was prepared to formally partner with the Daniel Hartfield Memorial Foundation on the scholarship program we had discussed. The university's development office had reviewed the proposal and had expressed enthusiasm about the partnership, noting that memorial scholarships created by families were among the most meaningful forms of philanthropic engagement with the institution. Professor Chun included preliminary timeline for announcing the scholarship and soliciting initial applications, suggesting that we could potentially award the first scholarship for the upcoming fall semester if we moved efficiently through the necessary administrative processes. This progress on the foundation represented tangible forward momentum that provided purpose and direction during a period that might otherwise have been consumed entirely by grief and conflict. I was building something meaningful from devastating loss, ensuring that Daniel's brief life would have lasting impact that extended far beyond the boundaries of personal memory. The foundation would support students who shared Daniel's passions and values, funding education and research that might contribute to solving environmental challenges he had worried about. This felt like the best possible response to loss that could not be prevented or undone, and it strengthened my resolve to protect the foundation from any interference or dilution by family members who had forfeited any claim on Daniel's legacy through their own choices and actions. The following week brought a shift in focus from legal defense and family conflict to the public dimensions of honoring Daniel's memory and launching the foundation's work. I had spent the previous 10 days necessarily focused on protective measures and boundary setting with family members who had demonstrated their unwillingness to respect either my grief or Daniel's legacy. Now I could turn attention toward the constructive and meaningful work of creating institutional capacity that would extend Daniel's values and commitments into the future through tangible programs and initiatives. Professor Raymond Chun had coordinated with the University of Washington's Communications Office to arrange a small memorial gathering and scholarship announcement that would take place on campus the following Friday afternoon. The event would be held in the Environmental Engineering Department's main lecture hall and would include brief remarks from faculty members who had worked with Daniel, an opportunity for students and colleagues to share memories and reflections, and a formal announcement of the Daniel Hartfield Memorial Foundation and its inaugural scholarship program. Professor Chun had emphasized that the gathering would be modest in scale and tone, designed to honor Daniel's memory authentically, rather than creating an elaborate public spectacle that would feel inconsistent with his personality and values. I appreciated this thoughtfulness about the character and scope of the memorial gathering. Daniel had been someone who valued substance over performance, and who would have been uncomfortable with excessive attention or elaborate public ceremonies focused on himself. The event Professor Chun had designed felt appropriate precisely because it centered on Daniel's work, his contributions to the academic community, and the causes he had cared about rather than creating a platform for performative grief or social display. The focus would be on launching meaningful initiatives, rather than simply commemorating loss. In preparation for the memorial gathering, I worked with Professor Chun to develop materials that would introduce the foundation and scholarship program to the academic community and potential supporters. We created a brief printed program that included Daniel's photograph, a biographical summary highlighting his academic achievements and environmental commitments, information about the foundation's mission and initial programs, and details about the scholarship criteria and application process. The program also included a statement I had written explaining why I had chosen to honor Daniel's memory through this particular approach, rather than through conventional memorials. Writing that statement had been emotionally challenging but ultimately clarifying. I explained that Daniel had been someone who believed deeply in the power of education and research to address urgent environmental challenges, and that he had planned to dedicate his professional career to developing renewable energy solutions that could contribute to climate stability while creating economic opportunities. The foundation and scholarship program would enable other young people to pursue similar goals with the kind of financial support and mentorship opportunities that Daniel himself had benefited from during his undergraduate education. The statement concluded by noting that memorial approaches that focus primarily on grief and loss felt insufficient for honoring someone whose life had been characterized by forward-looking optimism and commitment to making tangible differences in the world. Beyond the printed materials, Professor Chun had coordinated with the university's development office to create a simple website for the foundation that would provide information about its mission, governance structure, and grant-making priorities. The website included a donation portal for people who wished to contribute additional funds to support the foundation's work beyond the initial endowment from Daniel's inheritance. Professor Chun noted that memorial scholarships often attracted contributions from community members who had been touched by the story or who wanted to support causes the deceased had cared about, and that the foundation might grow substantially beyond its initial funding if we created appropriate mechanisms for accepting and managing such contributions. This possibility of the foundation expanding beyond what I could personally fund represented both opportunity and responsibility. If the foundation attracted significant external support, it would require more sophisticated governance and operational structures than I had initially contemplated. I would need to recruit qualified board members who could provide expertise in areas like investment management, grant evaluation, and nonprofit administration. The foundation would need to establish clear policies and procedures for evaluating funding proposals, measuring program outcomes, and ensuring that resources were being used effectively to advance the stated mission. These operational considerations were complex, but they also represented the foundation becoming a genuine institution, rather than simply a personal memorial gesture. I spent several days that week researching best practices in foundation governance and scholarship administration, reading materials from organizations that supported nonprofit effectiveness and philanthropic excellence. I learned about common pitfalls that family foundations encountered, including insufficient attention to formal governance processes, inadequate evaluation of program effectiveness, and confusion between personal preferences and strategic grant-making priorities. I also studied examples of successful memorial scholarship programs that had sustained impact over decades by establishing clear criteria, maintaining financial discipline, and adapting thoughtfully to changing circumstances while remaining faithful to core values. This research reinforced my conviction that the foundation needed to be structured as a serious institutional entity, rather than a casual charitable activity. Daniel deserved a legacy that would be professionally managed and strategically focused, producing measurable results rather than simply distributing funds based on sentiment or convenience. I began drafting governance documents that would establish clear decision-making processes, conflict of interest policies, and evaluation frameworks for assessing whether the Foundation's activities were effectively advancing its mission. These documents would provide structure and accountability that would serve the Foundation well as it matured and potentially expanded beyond my direct personal management. Thursday evening, I received an unexpected phone call from a woman named Jennifer Morrison who introduced herself as a reporter for the Portland Tribune, a local newspaper that covered regional news and community affairs. Jennifer explained that she had learned about Daniel's death and about the foundation I was establishing in his memory through contacts at the University of Washington, and she was interested in writing a feature article about both the tragedy of losing a promising young environmental engineer and the positive legacy being created through the scholarship program. She asked whether I would be willing to participate in an interview that would provide the foundation with publicity, while also telling Daniel's story to a broader audience. My initial reaction to this request was hesitation and concern about privacy during an intensely painful period. The thought of discussing Daniel's death and my grief with a journalist for publication in a newspaper felt exposing and potentially exploitative. However, as I considered the request more carefully, I recognized that publicity could serve legitimate purposes beyond satisfying public curiosity. A well-crafted article could raise awareness about the foundation among potential supporters, donors, and scholarship applicants. It could honor Daniel's memory by highlighting his commitments and values to people who had never known him personally, and it could demonstrate that devastating loss could be transformed into meaningful action, rather than simply endured passively. I told Jennifer that I would consider her request and respond within 24 hours after discussing the matter with my attorney and the Foundation's academic partners. Jennifer provided her contact information and emphasized that she would approach the story with sensitivity and respect, focusing on Daniel's life and legacy rather than sensationalizing his death or intruding on private grief. After concluding the call, I immediately contacted Michael Chun to discuss the potential benefits and risks of participating in such an interview. Michael's response was characteristically thoughtful and balanced. He noted that publicity could indeed benefit the foundation by raising its profile and attracting support, but he also cautioned that once information entered the public domain through media coverage, I would lose control over how it was used or interpreted. He particularly emphasized that any public discussion of Daniel's inheritance and the foundation's funding sources might inadvertently create ammunition for my family members if they chose to challenge my decisions or claim that I had misappropriated funds. Michael recommended that if I chose to participate in the interview, I should be extremely careful about what financial information I disclosed and should focus primarily on Daniel's life, the foundation's mission, and the scholarship program rather than on family conflict or estate details. I also consulted with Professor Chun, who had more experience with media relations through his academic work in university communications. Professor Chun was enthusiastic about the potential publicity and felt that a feature article in a respected regional newspaper could significantly enhance the foundation's credibility and visibility. He offered to participate in the interview as well if that would be helpful, providing perspective on Daniel's academic work and the significance of the scholarship program for supporting environmental engineering education. Professor Chen's willingness to share responsibility for the interview made the prospect feel less daunting and more like a collaborative effort to honor Daniel appropriately. After these consultations, I decided to accept Jennifer Morrison's request for an interview with clear parameters about topics I would and would not discuss. I called Jennifer back and explained that I would be willing to talk about Daniel's life, his academic and environmental interests, the foundation's mission, and the scholarship program, but that I would not be discussing family relationships, estate details, or personal financial information. Jennifer agreed to these boundaries and we scheduled an interview for the following Tuesday at my home, with Professor Chun joining by phone to provide additional perspective on Daniel's academic work. Friday arrived with a mixture of anticipation and anxiety about the memorial gathering at the University of Washington. I had not been to campus since collecting Daniel's belongings from his apartment the week after his death, and returning to a place so deeply associated with his recent life felt emotionally fraught. However, I also recognized that this gathering represented an important transition from the acute crisis phase of grief toward something resembling forward movement and purposeful activity. The foundation was becoming real through this public launch, and Daniel's memory was being honored in ways that reflected his actual values and commitments. I drove to Seattle early Friday afternoon, allowing extra time to navigate campus parking and locate the environmental engineering building where the gathering would take place. The October weather had turned genuinely autumnal, with temperatures in the low 50s and intermittent rain showers that matched my somber mood. As I walked across campus toward the engineering complex, I passed groups of students moving between classes, absorbed in conversations about assignments and social plans, inhabiting the ordinary rhythms of undergraduate life that Daniel would never complete. The contrast between their normalcy and my devastation felt surreal and disorienting. Professor Chan met me outside the lecture hall and provided a brief overview of the event schedule before we entered. Approximately 40 people had confirmed attendance, including faculty members from the environmental engineering program, several of Daniel's classmates and friends, staff from the campus sustainability initiative, and representatives from the university's development office. The gathering would last approximately 90 minutes, with the first hour dedicated to remembrances and reflections followed by 30 minutes for the formal scholarship announcement and reception. Professor Chan had arranged for light refreshments to be available, and the printed programs I had helped design were stacked on a table near the entrance. As people began arriving and taking seats in the lecture hall, I was struck by the genuine affection and respect evident in how Daniel's classmates and colleagues spoke about him. Multiple students approached me to share specific memories of Daniel, helping them understand difficult concepts, inviting them to join study groups, or encouraging them when they felt overwhelmed by challenging coursework. Faculty members described Daniel as the kind of student who elevated classroom discussions through thoughtful questions, and who approached research projects with unusual maturity and independence. These accounts provided a portrait of Daniel's impact on his academic community that complemented but extended beyond what I had known about his college experience through our regular phone conversations and visits. The formal program began with brief welcoming remarks from the department chair, Dr. Elizabeth Warren, who contextualized Daniel's academic trajectory within the environmental engineering program and emphasized the significance of memorial scholarships in supporting students who shared his commitments. Professor Chan then delivered a more personal reflection on Daniel's intellectual curiosity, his integration of technical knowledge with ethical considerations, and his genuine excitement about using engineering skills to address climate challenges. Professor Chen's remarks were substantive and specific rather than generic, citing particular research projects and classroom contributions that demonstrated Daniel's capabilities and character. Several of Daniel's classmates shared remembrances that were both touching and occasionally humorous, painting a picture of someone who was serious about his work, but also maintained perspective and warmth in his relationships. One student described Daniel's practice of organizing weekend hiking trips for engineering students who were feeling burned out by academic pressure, combining outdoor recreation with informal discussions about career goals and life direction. Another student recalled Daniel's willingness to tutor anyone who asked for help regardless of whether they were personal friends, motivated by genuine belief that everyone deserves support in pursuing difficult educational goals. These stories revealed dimensions of Daniel's generosity and leadership that had been less visible to me as his mother, but that had clearly mattered significantly to his peers. When the remembrance portion of the program concluded, I was invited to speak about the foundation and scholarship program. I had prepared brief remarks that I had practiced multiple times in the preceding days, but standing before this group of people who had known and valued Daniel created an emotional intensity that threatened to overwhelm my composure. I took a moment to steady myself before beginning, focusing on the purpose of the gathering rather than on my personal grief. I explained that Daniel had been someone who believed deeply in the power of education and innovation to address environmental challenges, and that he had planned to dedicate his professional career to developing renewable energy solutions. The foundation and scholarship program would honor his memory by supporting other students who shared his passions and commitments, providing financial resources and mentorship opportunities that would enable them to pursue meaningful work without being constrained primarily by economic necessity. I emphasized that the scholarship was not simply about providing money, but about creating community and connection among students who cared about environmental sustainability, fostering the kind of collaborative relationships that Daniel had valued throughout his undergraduate experience. I announced that the inaugural Daniel Hartfield Environmental Innovation Scholarship would provide $25,000 annually to a selected undergraduate student, renewable for up to 3 years contingent on continued academic progress and engagement with environmental engineering. The scholarship would include not just financial support, but also a paid summer research assistantship, mentorship from faculty members working on renewable energy projects, and opportunities to present research at academic conferences. Applications would be accepted beginning the following week, with selection to occur in early December, and the award to be effective for the spring semester. The announcement generated visible enthusiasm among students in attendance, several of whom approached me afterward to express interest in applying or to ask questions about the selection criteria. Their genuine excitement about the opportunity provided reassurance that the foundation was addressing real needs, and that Daniel's legacy would benefit students who would truly appreciate and make productive use of the resources being offered. This was exactly the kind of outcome I had hoped to create. Tangible support for worthy students that would advance environmental causes Daniel had cared about while keeping his memory alive in meaningful, rather than merely sentimental ways. During the reception following the formal program, I had numerous conversations with people who shared stories about Daniel or expressed support for the Foundation's work. The director of the Campus Sustainability Initiative, a dynamic woman in her 30s named Dr. Maria Santos, expressed interest in potential partnerships between the Foundation and campus environmental programs beyond the scholarship. She described several student-led conservation projects that needed funding and noted that the Foundation could potentially support practical applied work that complemented the more research-focused scholarship program. We exchanged contact information and agreed to schedule a follow-up conversation about collaborative possibilities. One particularly meaningful interaction occurred with a young woman named Jessica Park who introduced herself as one of Daniel's laboratory partners in an advanced renewable energy systems course. Jessica explained that she and Daniel had spent countless hours together working on complex engineering problems, and that she had been devastated by his death both because of personal friendship and because of recognition that the field had lost someone with exceptional potential. Jessica asked whether the Foundation might consider supporting collaborative research teams rather than only individual scholars, noting that Daniel had been passionate about the importance of interdisciplinary collaboration in addressing complex environmental challenges. This suggestion resonated immediately because it aligned with Daniel's actual approach to his work and his belief that meaningful innovation required bringing together diverse perspectives and expertise. I told Jessica that I would discuss with Professor Chan the possibility of expanding the Foundation's activities to include team-based research grants in addition to the individual scholarship program. This conversation exemplified exactly what I had hoped the memorial gathering would produce: substantive ideas about how to honor Daniel's values through programs that reflected his actual commitments rather than generic charitable activities. As the gathering concluded and people began departing, Professor Chan and I spent a few additional minutes debriefing about the event and discussing next steps for the scholarship application process. He expressed satisfaction with the turnout and the quality of the remembrances, noting that the event had struck an appropriate balance between honoring Daniel's memory and launching practical initiatives. We confirmed plans for him to chair the scholarship selection committee and to coordinate with the university's financial aid office regarding the administrative dimensions of awarding and managing the scholarship funds. I drove back to Portland that evening feeling emotionally exhausted, but also experiencing something resembling peace for the first time since Daniel's death. The memorial gathering had been genuinely meaningful rather than merely performative, focusing on Daniel's actual life and values rather than on abstract expressions of sympathy. The scholarship program was becoming operational through concrete administrative processes, rather than remaining a theoretical concept. The Foundation was attracting interest and support from people who could help ensure its long-term effectiveness and impact. These developments represented real progress in transforming devastating loss into lasting positive legacy. The contrast between this constructive and meaningful memorial process and my family's behavior remained stark and painful. While I was working to honor Daniel through initiatives that reflected his values and that would benefit causes he cared about, My family had demonstrated that their primary concern was accessing his inheritance for personal consumption. While Daniel's academic community had gathered to remember his contributions and launch programs that would extend his commitments, my family had chosen celebration over compassion and greed over decency. This contrast confirmed repeatedly that I had made the right decisions about protecting Daniel's legacy from people who had forfeited any claim to participate in shaping how he would be remembered. Saturday morning brought the scheduled interview with Jennifer Morrison from the Portland Tribune. Jennifer arrived at my home precisely on time, accompanied by a photographer who would take a few images to accompany the article. Jennifer was a woman in her early 40s with a professional but warm demeanor that immediately put me somewhat at ease despite my anxiety about the interview. She explained her approach to the story and the themes she hoped to explore, emphasizing that she viewed this as a piece about resilience, purpose, and transformation of grief into meaningful action, rather than as a conventional tragedy narrative. We spent nearly 2 hours talking about Daniel's life, his environmental commitments, his academic trajectory, and the foundation I was establishing in his memory. Jennifer asked thoughtful questions that went beyond surface details to explore Daniel's character, his relationships with faculty and fellow students, and the specific ways that his values were being reflected in the foundation's mission and programs. She respected the boundaries I had established about not discussing family conflict or financial details, instead keeping the focus on Daniel's legacy and the positive initiatives being launched in his name. Professor Chan joined the interview by phone for approximately 30 minutes, providing perspective on Daniel's academic work and explaining the significance of memorial scholarships in supporting environmental engineering education. His contributions added credibility and context to the article, while also demonstrating that the foundation had genuine institutional support, rather than being merely a personal project. Jennifer seemed particularly interested in Professor Chen's descriptions of Daniel's research interests and his observations about the kind of student Daniel had been, noting that these details would help readers understand why the scholarship program was structured in the specific ways we had designed. The photographer took several images of me holding Daniel's photograph and standing in front of bookshelves containing his environmental policy books and research materials. I felt somewhat uncomfortable being photographed during such a vulnerable time, but I recognized that visual images would make the article more compelling and would help readers connect emotionally with Daniel's story. The photographer worked efficiently and respectfully, taking only the minimum number of images necessary and avoiding intrusive or overly intimate shots that would have felt exploitative. When the interview concluded, Jennifer thanked me for my willingness to share Daniel's story and explained that the article would likely be published the following week, after she completed additional research and interviewed a few other sources who could provide context about memorial scholarships and environmental engineering education. She emphasized again that she would send me a draft before publication to ensure factual accuracy and to verify that I was comfortable with how Daniel and the foundation were being portrayed. This offer provided reassurance that I would have some oversight over the final product, and that Jennifer was genuinely committed to handling the story sensitively, rather than simply extracting information for sensational purposes. The week concluded with me feeling that significant progress had been made in multiple dimensions of honoring Daniel's memory and establishing the foundation as a genuine institutional entity. The memorial gathering had been meaningful and well attended, generating enthusiasm among potential scholarship applicants and creating opportunities for partnerships with campus environmental programs. The interview with the Portland Tribune would provide valuable publicity that could attract additional support and raise awareness about the foundation's work. The administrative and governance frameworks were taking shape through careful planning and consultation with experienced advisors. Most importantly, I was discovering that purposeful action in service of Daniel's values provided a sustainable path through grief that was more bearable than passive suffering would have been. My family remained conspicuously absent from all of these developments, having forfeited through their own choices any role in shaping how Daniel would be remembered or how his legacy would be honored. Their absence was painful but also clarifying, removing complications and conflicts that would have inevitably arisen if they had been involved in foundation planning or scholarship decisions. The memorial process was cleaner and more authentic without their participation, focused entirely on Daniel's actual values, rather than being distorted by family politics or personal agendas. This silver lining to their betrayal did not diminish the hurt of their initial abandonment, But it did make the ongoing work of building the foundation somewhat easier than it might otherwise have been. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.